Hi, I'm Maggie. Thank you for stopping by Crafts the Charm today. I'm so glad you're here. Dollar Tree has this garden edging, which looks like wrought iron, but it's plastic. And I've made a number of crafts with it in the past, but I'm not done yet. Let's go have some fun.
I want to start by updating my hanging porch decor. You saw me create this sometime in December, and even though we're still having snowstorms, I'm really ready to update this for spring. Now the wood piece itself is made out of fence pieces, and I made a second one of these for my channel, so I'll include a link here if you want to see the full process and the measurements for making this. But here's just a very abbreviated version here. Basically, I cut fence pieces and stapled and glued them together. This white one I made before I had a channel. It's not quite as well made as the black one, and it's painted with exterior white paint. So the first thing I'm going to do is take it down and remove all of the items that I had hot glued to it. And most of these, even though they're plastic, I was able to remove without breaking them, but two of them broke, so I guess I'll have to get creative next year and maybe do something a little bit different. You'll also notice that the glue peeled off some of the paint, so we're going to give it another coat of paint. I'm going to paint it with this Home Decor chalk paint, and the color is Adirondack, which seemed like a perfect color for an outdoor piece in New England. And previously, I had painted it and then sanded it to give it a worn look, but I think this time I'm just going to give it a more solid color, so a fresher coat of paint. Now this paint is old and it had started to solidify some, so I'm just mixing in a very small amount of water just to loosen the paint up and then stirring it. And then I'm just going to paint the piece. Now that that's nice and fresh and while it's drying, let's turn to the garden edging. Now I'm going to describe this as an arch with a fleur-de-lis inside, even though I don't know that that inside piece is really technically a fleur-de-lis. I'm not sure what to call it. So that's what I'm going to call it. And you can remove those fleur-de-lis from inside the arch, but it's going to leave them with missing parts. So you'll see. And I do have a few tips for removing them. So first, it's really pretty easy to cut through this plastic with shears. So you can cut the top swirls easily away from the frame with your shears. But once you get down to the bottom, there's a part where there's a raised piece on the back side, which is a sort of a wedge shape with a curve, and you really can't cut through that easily with shears. So the way that I did this was I cut everything until I got to those pieces, and then I used a knife and slid it along the edge of that wedge piece, and then I was able to fold it away and cut it with the shears. So for each piece, those two little bottom legs, you're going to probably want to cut them with a box cutter and then finish the job with your shears. So I'm going to need 6 of those, one for each leg of my snowflake. So there are 4 on one piece of garden edging, so I'm going to need 1.5 pieces of garden edging to get enough of those middle pieces, or sort of fleur-de-lis. And then what we have left is the arches, and I'm going to try to arrange the arches into a design in the center. I am not entirely successful, but you've seen the thumbnail, so you know roughly what this looks like, and you can watch my process, and maybe if you decide to do this, you will be able to do it a little neater than I do it. But basically, I just cut those away from each other, and I take 6 of those as well. So again, 1.5 pieces of the garden edging. I guess I'll say right now, I think if you make sure they're all the same size, then you will have better luck at making a symmetrical middle piece. I think part of the reason I didn't is that the edge pieces are a little bit longer than the middle pieces. So I would say cut them all the same size once you've cut them all off. Trim a couple of them. Okay, so it looked pretty good to start. This is how I have it laid out on the snowflake. And I'm going to say you probably don't need to do all the repair work on these that I do, because you can't really see the edges of the fleur-de-lis pieces. Mine are going on a wall that is yellow, and so I think that you will be able to see the damage on them when I put it up on a wall. But if this were going on a brick wall or a darker wall like this green carpet, then you might be able to leave it roughly like this, just glue them on and call it a day, and that's pretty easy. One thing I did want to do was tape those pieces together in the middle so that I had the proportions basically correct. It didn't do me any good. I still made a mess of it, but I want it to fit basically in the middle of this snowflake when I'm done. Okay, so they are layered over each other, and I need this to lie flat. So what I did was I used a pencil to mark where one piece would go over another, and then I cut the lower piece so the top piece could fit over. And for each of these little arches, I cut each one only once. So I cut the piece that was going over each time, and that way each piece only has one cut in it. So it's one piece and then a hole and then its little end piece. So in the past, when I've tried to repair these little fleur-de-lis, what I've done is I've cut a piece of cardboard to fit over the back in the shape that I want, and then glued that on with hot glue and filled in the missing parts, so sort of shaped it up with the hot glue. I thought I would try homemade air dry clay this time. My concern was that it wouldn't stick to the pieces, but I thought if it doesn't, we can glue it on after. So I made up a very small batch of the homemade air dry clay, and it was just enough. So I used a 1/4 cup of baking soda, and then 1/8 of a cup of cornstarch and 1/8 of a cup of water. You heat that over medium heat, stirring continuously until it forms into clay. And I have a 2-minute technique on making this clay, so I'll put that here. I just wanted you to know the amounts that I used here. And then what I did was basically pushed it into the back, because there's a channel in the back of this, and just tried to mold it to make up the parts that were missing. Once it was all filled in, I just sprayed some water over it and then rubbed it with my finger to smooth it so I wouldn't have to do too much sanding when it dried. So I did that for all 6 of the fleur-de-lis pieces. And then for the middle piece, I used this aluminum wire. This is very inexpensive at the Home Depot. It's pretty weak wire, but I used this and hot glue and a little bit of masking tape to connect these pieces together. So I would cut a piece of the wire and then lay it through the pieces like where they link together, and then filled in with hot glue. And then, I don't know if I had to do this, but I put some masking tape on the joints just because I was afraid when I flipped it, it wouldn't hold together. But you can see already it is not symmetrical, and I should have fixed that right there. I think I did end up fixing one of the pieces, cutting it a little bit smaller. Now the little ends don't connect together, of course. In some places they connect together better than others. And again, I think if I had cut some of those pieces shorter, maybe they would have all connected together. But what I ended up doing was laying some masking tape across the front, and then on the back, filling in with hot glue and folding the masking tape over. So sort of using the masking tape as a mold to hold the hot glue into that pointy shape at the end, and then folding the tape all over. And then once I had it all taped, I used the leftover air dry clay to smooth over all of the seams and to cover those taped areas. Now, even though I did wipe over all of these with water to smooth them out, they all did need just a little bit of sanding, I felt, before I was going to paint them. Now, maybe this isn't necessary because I am going to put on a little bit of a texture when I paint it, but I didn't want lumps. Like, I can see some lumps there. So I did sand over it, and this is just a Dollar Tree sanding block that I used. Okay, and when I was sanding them, one piece came out, and it really snapped back into place really well, but to hold it in there, I just used some white glue or school glue to put that piece back in place. And I didn't have any accidents after that. Nothing else fell apart. Now to paint them, I do not want a shiny finish, and I do want a textured finish. So if you look at the original pieces, they have a little bit of a texture to them, and the homemade air dry clay doesn't. It's smooth. So I wanted to replace that texture. So I am using black acrylic paint and mixing some baking soda into the paint so that I can use it to create texture. So the first thing I did was just paint it over all of the pieces, and then I went back in with a little bit more and dabbed over the entire surface to give it a texture. And I think you can even see some of that texture on the video. Now when they dried, you could see the baking soda. They had this white or gray tinge that was coming through. It looked almost like mold. And I haven't had that happen before, but I'm thinking that maybe I've always used baking soda with lighter colored paint. I wasn't looking for a shiny finish. I wanted to have a finish similar to the original finish, but I was surprised that the baking soda came through. So what I decided to do was paint over it with this Art Home Decor chalk paint in rich black, and this has a matte finish. So it's not going to harm the texture. I'm just going to paint lightly over to cover up the baking soda finish that I have there. And now I'm just going to hot glue and use a little bit of wire to connect everything to the wood snowflake. And it was a little bit tricky getting it positioned correctly because that middle piece is not symmetrical. But I did my best, and I just glued them down where they were going to touch the snowflake. And then because hot glue is not entirely reliable, I used a little bit of this black floral wire from the Dollar Tree. So let's call those little things at the top of the fleur-de-lis its little arms. What I did was I wrapped the floral wire around one arm, brought it around the back, wrapped it around the other arm, and fastened it in the back. So it's really quite invisible because it is black floral wire and it's just overlapping the black areas in the front and then tied in the back where you can't see it. There was really no way for me to do that with the piece in the middle, so we'll have to see if that stays on or not. And I'm not sure it's the worst thing in the world if that thing falls off. Maybe I'll just try to recreate it and make it better. But for now, that's glued on. Now for my second piece, I'm going to make a sort of a lantern, and we're going to start with one of these 8-inch wreath rings from the Dollar Tree. They come in a pack of 2. Now if you have an 8-inch wood disc, you could use that. I noticed that Joann's sells one and it's about $10, and I'm sure you can get them other places. It was not in stock at any Joann's near me, so I thought I would try to improvise. And this is of course much less expensive, so definitely worth a try. So what I'm going to do is trace around this wreath ring onto a piece of thick cardboard. And then I'm going to cut that out with a box cutter knife and then trim it until it fits inside the back of the wreath. So I didn't want to cut it too small at first because I did want it to fit in a little bit tightly. So I cut it around the line that I drew and then trimmed it a little bit until it fit inside. And then we're going to want a second piece, and for this one you're going to trace around that second ring in the wreath, not the inner ring, but the second ring, and cut that. And that's going to fit inside the top. And then where there are those pieces which hold the rings together, I just cut little slits so that it wouldn't sit on top of those but would rather push down a little tighter. And then I just used hot glue to glue that whole thing together. Now it doesn't look much like a piece of wood. So what we're going to do now is decoupage over it, and I'm going to use white glue mixed with water and some gauze. And so I'm just cutting the gauze in lengths that will fit over the disc and around the back, and then just soaking them in the glue and water, wringing them out, and then applying them to the piece, and applying them all in one direction, not on the back, but over the top, because this is going to be our simulated wood grain. And so then what I did was I had a little bit of gauze left over, so I actually cut a couple more pieces that were thin and laid them over in other places where I thought there might be some wood grain, but again, in the same direction, and tried to press down the edges so it looked like a beveled piece of wood. Now I want this to look like a piece of wood painted white because I do want it to match basically with my wall hanging. So I am going to use the same home decor chalk paint in Adirondack. I decided to put a little shading on the piece before I painted it, or I started to paint it and then I thought, I want something behind this. So I'm going to use some gray paint, which is just some apple barrel paint in the color pewter. And honestly, I didn't like this color. I feel like it's a little too green. And I've mixed it with water, and I'm just sort of putting it on lightly over this. And then I did the same thing with some burnt umber. And then once that had completely dried, then I painted over that with the chalk paint. And I thought if a little bit showed through, it would look like the texture of wood. But when it dried, I felt like too much of it had shown through, so I did paint it again. So in the end, I don't think that you could see that painting that I did at all. So I don't think you need to do that step, but maybe if you felt like with it showing through a little bit, it did look like rough wood, I'm not sure. So to finish it off, once it had dried, I just dry brushed some of the burnt umber over it. And that's just put a little bit on the paintbrush and then get a lot off because you can always go heavier. In fact, I went a little too heavy and ended up painting over it in some places a little bit. So I don't know how successful this is as a piece of wood. I would say only a little bit, but it is mostly going to be covered, so I think it's good enough. I would have preferred to have the disc of wood, but this is an alternative that is inexpensive. Now for the garden fencing, we're going to cut off the little stakes that you use to stick the garden fencing in the ground. Now I mostly use my shears for this, and the two pieces on the end cut off very easily with the shears. It was a little harder to get at that piece in the middle, so what I did was I scored it with my box cutter knife, and then when I bent it, it just snapped off, so that was perfect. And these pieces connect together, but what I'm going to do is turn it around and connect it to itself. Now when you do that, you don't get a nice circle at all. So I am outside, I am wearing a respirator, and I have my heat gun, and I am going to melt and reshape this a little bit. Now when you are applying heat with a heat gun, do not apply it for very long. You will see the piece start to lose some of its texture, or you'll see it warp or move away from you. You don't want it to warp too much. I melted it in one place, not very much. So heat it and then bend it the way you want, and just be patient, go around, heat and bend. What I found was most successful was starting with that base, heating those long base pieces, and then bending into a circle. And I got a pretty good circle shape that way. And then it was just a matter of sort of touching it up in places. So all of those little curlicues on the fleur-de-lis pieces were still sticking straight out. So I heated each of those, and I heated them sort of at the joint where they connect to the frame, and then bent them inwards. The same thing with some of the little points. And also the top part, those little arches, those all sort of pointed out a little bit once I got it into a circle. So I heated those and bent them in a little bit as well. And once I was done, it really was a pretty good circle. And what you have is a circle with an 8-inch diameter. So you can then put that on top of your wood piece if you have a wood piece, or faux wood piece if you have a faux wood piece. And I just put a pewter vase with some Dollar Tree floral pieces inside. But you could put candles inside, or a simpler vase, or I don't know, maybe something else. And here are the two pieces. We're not ready to go outside yet, again because of the snow, but I have hung the wall piece outdoors.
So what did you think of our spring decor with the Dollar Tree wrought iron look garden edging? Please tell me in the comments. I was really excited to be able to use that garden edging with my fence piece, decor piece that I like to update every season. If you liked this video, please give it a thumbs up. And if you enjoy this sort of content, please subscribe to Crafts the Charm. Thank you for spending time with me today. Take care.